Hello Year 7, this is Mr. Tilley, the Head of History. For many of you, you've been studying Queen Elizabeth quite recently, and what I'd like to do in today's session is look at how Queen Elizabeth I liked to be portrayed and how she tried to use, in particular, portraits or paintings to convey a certain image of herself. A bit like modern politicians like Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, they're very careful in how they are portrayed, and they try to control the media and the images that the media have of them because they want to be portrayed as statesmen in a very assured and confident manner, engaged in productive and successful events and issues. Obviously, they want to reduce the amount of bad publicity they get, and Queen Elizabeth was very similar in that regard. She wanted to be portrayed as a rightful heir, a successful queen, and in order to do so, she would try and project that image by controlling the portraits that were shown of her. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at how Tudor portraits were used, particularly by Queen Elizabeth, as forms of propaganda. And we're going to try and decipher the symbolic information that's contained in these pictures. Now, why are paintings and pictures important to us as historians? They tell us information about people or events. They not only show what happened, but perhaps more importantly, tell us how people thought and felt about those issues and events. They can be used to send out messages and can be used to try and make people think in a certain way. And this is called propaganda. Now, why did Elizabeth in particular use paintings? Well, she wanted to show herself to the people to gain support. She came to the throne at a very difficult time in England's history. We'd had the roller coaster of religion, which you studied in your lessons, going from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic and back to Protestant under Elizabeth. And she was trying to really establish herself as a rightful queen, someone who had the right to be queen at a time when many people in society were dubious about a woman being queen, but also particularly a Protestant queen. The country got used to being Catholic again under Queen Mary, and many Catholics were against the idea of Elizabeth becoming the Queen of England. She wanted to look powerful, clever and beautiful, and it was important to impress people because many people believed a woman was not strong enough to rule, believe it or not. And only paintings chosen by Elizabeth were allowed to be created and shown. So what's just appeared onto the screen is perhaps one of the most famous portraits of Queen Elizabeth, which is the Rainbow portrait, painted in 1600. Now this was just shortly before the end of her reign. She was quite old by this stage. She was actually 67 years of age. Not that you'd know that from this painting. Now, if you look very carefully at the picture, do you notice anything strange about the portrait? You should hopefully begin to see a few things that are a bit unusual. So why might Elizabeth have wanted to be presented in this way? So what we're going to do today is a bit of source analysis. We are going to look at this picture in a bit more detail. And you can see in this painting a serpent, a rainbow, and a gauntlet, amongst other things. But more importantly, what are these things telling us about Elizabeth and how she wanted to be perceived by others? So if you look very, very carefully at this painting, you should see the following things that are down the left-hand side of the slide here. You should see the eyes and ears, the long hair, the heart, the serpent, the angel's wings, the fruit basket, the flowers, the jeweled glove, also known as a gauntlet, and the rainbow. So what do these things tell us about Elizabeth? What message was she trying to give to people? How was she trying to portray herself in this painting? So if I go on the next slide, you can now see a closer or more detailed view of the painting. And around the outside, I've got the red arrows, which are pointing to various things. So what I'd like you to try and do is take a couple of moments just to identify what the arrows are pointing to. Now at this stage, you can stop the presentation or pause it and give yourself time to do that. Right, so I'm going to move on now. So hopefully, with the time that you've spent looking at it, you should have noticed the following things. So the angel's wings, the jeweled gauntlet or glove, the heart, the rainbow, the flowers, the long hair, the headdress like a food basket, the serpent or snake on her sleeve, and the eyes and ears. Now, all very strange, I'm sure you will agree, but each one of these has a very powerful, poignant message which is trying to be conveyed to the viewer. But what are those messages? What do these things, these symbols actually mean? Now, to people in Elizabeth's time, these would have had great meaning. obviously to us today they're a little harder to perhaps work out. So your task is to guess what each feature represents about Elizabeth. And on the next slide, you're going to have a table and you're going to be able to guess what each of these things represents. And then I will give you the answers as to what they actually do mean. And you can just compare how successful you've been in trying to deduce what these symbols actually mean. So in this table, you've got all the different things identified in the painting down the left. Your job is to guess what they mean. And then once you've tried to guess what they mean, I'm going to give you the answers and you're going to try and match up the answers with the actual symbols. Now, I've got a few clues here for you now on this next slide, which you can use. Once you've done your guessing, you can then use these to help you complete your table correctly. So if I move on to this next slide there, so you've had a bit of time there, perhaps stop the slides to have a look. The answers are as follows. So the angel's wings, hopefully you would have understood that they mean that she was a messenger from God. It was her right to rule. God had given her this divine right to be queen. And she wanted to show this because remember at this time there were a lot of people who believed that she wasn't the legitimate queen, didn't have the right to rule. And that related back to Henry, King Henry, who was her father. And basically he'd married to a lady called Catherine of Aragon, who was unable to give him a son. Now, having a son was very important because it meant it kept the lineage going forward for the Tudor dynasty and for Henry. And he was desperate for a son. She couldn't give him a son, so he began to have an affair with another young lady called Anne Boleyn, and he wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. But at this time, the Pope and the Catholic Church obviously were against divorce, and the Pope would not allow this. So Henry, being Henry, decided he was going to go through with this anyway and got the Archbishop of Canterbury to give him her divorce. But the Pope obviously refused to acknowledge the legality of that divorce and basically said that when Henry married, his new marriage to Anne Boleyn was not legal, and therefore any children he had would not be legitimate heirs to the throne. So Elizabeth was seen by many as being illegitimate, and when she became queen, she faced that accusation from a number of people, well, groups within her society at that time. The eyes and ears represent the fact that Elizabeth can see and hear what's happening around the country and indeed across Europe. She had a network of spies and informants who would keep an eye out for her and to make sure that any rebellions or plots against her life were unearthed. So this was an idea to sort of get people to feel that the Queen knows everything that they're doing, can see everything that they're doing, and, you know, perhaps make people think twice about trying to challenge her. The rainbow, well, the rainbow is often seen as a peaceful symbol, you know, the idea of Elizabeth bringing calm and prosperity and peace after a storm. Now that storm could be referencing perhaps the religious problems that have swept across England and Europe during this period of time, the fact that Elizabeth has weathered attempts against her life, the Spanish Armada, and come out successfully and brought stability to her country. The jewel gauntlet shows that men are prepared to fight for Elizabeth. It shows that people are loyal to her and willing to help her and defend her realm against aggressors and opponents. The headdress, well, during this period of time, famine was a real possibility. If you had bad weather and poor harvests, people could actually starve. So any good monarch would make sure that their people are well fed and provided for. Everyone wants to be known as wise or clever, and Elizabeth was no exception. She was a very intelligent woman who spoke many different languages, and the serpent on her arm shows that she's a wise ruler. The bridal hair is a sign of virginity. Now remember that Elizabeth never married. There's a number of reasons for that. One was it was difficult for her to find anyone to marry, because if she married a Protestant, she'd anger the Catholics, and if she married a Catholic man, it would anger the Protestants. So that was one issue. Secondly, at this time, it was a male-dominated society, and I think Elizabeth was actually worried that if she married a man, that the man would dominate the relationship and take more control away from her. And she wanted to show that she was a strong, independent woman, more than capable of ruling the country by herself. So she took that sort of view that that would be the direction that she would go in. And hopefully, by doing so, avoid any sort of friction or conflict within society between Catholics and Protestants. The flowers represent a sign of chastity, the fact that she was youthful, that she was a virgin, that she was going to almost wed herself to the country and rule in the country. That was her main role. That's what she was going to focus on. And finally, the heart shows that Elizabeth loves her people and her country. Now, I'm sure, and I hope many of you worked out a lot of the symbology there. If you didn't, don't worry. Obviously, you've got the answers there to sort of bring you up to speed. But now you've got the hang of this and you're beginning to understand that these pictures are loaded with symbology. I'm going to give you a little bit of a test in that we are going to look at some other examples of paintings. This slide you got here just gives you a few helpful hints for interpreting the symbols within paintings from the Tudor period, some of which we've used already, but others are new, and you can keep referring back to that slide as we go through. So the next portrait I want to show you is the Armada portrait, and here we can see a picture of Queen Elizabeth, and in this painting there are again some very significant symbols. So if we go through them, there's a crown on the top left, on the right hand side and top left hand side there are two sort of paintings of ships, some floating along very nicely on top of the waves, and on the right hand side ships being sort of dashed against the rocks. Bottom left you can see a globe, and Elizabeth has her hand on that globe. Why would that be the case? And then on the right hand side she's wearing a dress which has got pearls all over it. So again, what are the pearls all about? So again, I'm going to give you a few moments. If you need to, you can flick back to the previous slide to look at the clues. But what do those images and those aspects of the painting represent? So if we reimpose that painting, you can see the crown is a symbol of royalty. Remember we said that many people said that she wasn't a legitimate queen. She was therefore trying to establish her rightful place as Queen of England by showing the crown there to her right. Her hand is on the globe because she obviously is all powerful and she wants to project this image of controlling and being in control of large areas of the globe, of the earth, particularly South America. She's got a hand on that region because that was an area controlled by the Spanish for large periods of this time I should say, and it was a very wealthy part of the world in terms of raw materials like gold, and Queen Elizabeth actually instructed English pirates to basically attack Spanish ships and steal their gold, which obviously angered King Philip of Spain, which led to the Spanish Armada, which you've studied in your lessons. So the two images at the top, on the left and the right, well, the left hand side shows English ships which are sailing out to meet the Armada, and on the right hand side you can see the Spanish ships who are being dashed against the rocks as they're being dispersed out into the open sea, and I'll come back to that later on. So that shows obviously her victory over the Spanish. And finally, the pearls are a symbol of purity and her high status. Remember we talked about her being the Virgin Queen, being pure and being of high status. So this image portrays Elizabeth in a very powerful self-righteous kind of manner, where she's saying, look, I am the rightful queen of the country. God has favoured me. He's helped me to beat the Spanish Armada. Initially the English sent fire ships into the Spanish Armada. It dispersed into the North Sea. It then sailed round the top of Britain, and as it came down the other side past Ireland, a huge storm hit the Armada and forced many of the ships onto the rocks around Ireland, destroying and sinking many of them, and only a few of the ships actually managed to make their way back to Spain. But the Queen sort of portrayed this as being divine intervention, that God had saved her from the Spanish Armada because she's obviously the rightful queen of this country. So this next portrait is called the Ermine portrait of Elizabeth I. It's painted by Nicholas Hilliard in 1585. Now again, you should notice a few strange things in this picture, but particularly the little animal down on the left hand side, which is an ermine. And again, if you go back to one of the previous slides with the little clues on, it'll tell you a little bit more about this creature and what it represents, but I'll come back to that in a moment. You can also see the sword, which is down by her left hand. Again, that is symbolic of something. And again, think carefully about what that might be trying to say or suggest or portray. And you'll also notice that the colour white and the colour black are very predominant in this picture, and those colours again have significance in Tudor times. So if we just go through, the ermine on Elizabeth's arm, well, that's a creature that symbolises purity and therefore her right to be queen. And it was actually believed that the ermine would rather die than get its fur dirty. So this is the idea that this queen is pure, is totally sort of driven and focused on being the Queen of England, and she was wedded to that role, hence the fact she never married and she remained this virgin queen. In addition, we've got the sword. I asked you to think about what that sword actually means. Well, it refers to her power and her right to rule, but also the fact that she can deal with issues and problems and has the power to control her country, but also that she will deliver justice for her people. Now the colour, or colours black and white, are the colours of the legendary Queen of Corinth, who was pure and wise. And again, we know that Elizabeth wanted to be seen as being wise, as a competent ruler of her country. Remember, there was a lot of prejudice at this time about women being rulers, and she was obviously trying to project this image that she had not only the might through the sword, but also the might through her mind to be a very successful and competent queen of this country. So this brings us on to our last portrait, the Ditchley portrait of Elizabeth I, painted in 1588 by Marcus Gierarts. She's shown standing on the village green of Ditchley in Oxfordshire, and it was painted for Sir Henry Lee, a courtier who lived in Ditchley. Now, in this painting, she obviously looks very regal again, a beautiful dress to show her wealth, to show her status, but she's also stood on a map, which is a bit odd. But if you think about it, what does that symbolise? Well, it symbolises that she is in control of her kingdom, that this is her kingdom, she has a right to rule, that she's all powerful, that she's in a very commanding position. You could also argue that the light that is opening up in the clouds to her right hand side could be portrayed as being God looking down on her, shining his light down on her, almost as if, again, it's this idea of this divine right, that she has the right to rule, and she's bringing the country into light from darkness. The spring flowers that you can see in her hair in particular represent Elizabeth's success and wisdom and show her reign as a time of eternal springtime. Now, we often think of springtime as a joyous time where we're coming out of the depths of winter, and it's the bringing forward a new life, new hope, prosperity. And if you think about the context to Elizabeth's reign, she came into the position of being queen at a very troubled time in the country's history, and she was trying to find a middle way, a way in which she could bring the different parts of society together in a more harmonious kind of way, with the Catholics and Protestants, trying to find a way of solving the religious conflict and strife that had afflicted this country for many years. And in many regards, she was very successful in doing that. And many historians have often argued that this was a golden era, the Elizabethan era, when she brought prosperity and wealth and stability to our country. Now, as Elizabeth got older, it became increasingly important to hide the signs of her age. And you might ask, well, why is that? Often we think today as people get older, they've got more wisdom, more experience. And, often when we think of politicians, we often think of perhaps people who are older having that experience and that sort of ability to govern because they've gone through various trials and tribulations. But obviously in her period of time, she was fighting against that prejudice that women couldn't be good rulers, that men were better designed or had the qualities necessary to be good rulers, whereas women did not. So she wanted to carry on projecting this youthful, dynamic image, and I suppose trying to keep herself looking young was a way in which she could do that. And again, in this painting, to show her purity, her face and clothes are white, and this is also why she's shown wearing the white pearls as well. In all of the pictures we've seen today, the pearls make an appearance, and they are there to show her sort of purity, to show her high status. this idea that she's the Virgin Queen who's really married essentially to the country and looking after the needs of her people and her country, rather than, you know, pandering to the needs of a husband. Well, this really brings us to the end of the presentation today. I hope you've enjoyed finding out more about Elizabeth I and her rule through the portraits and paintings that she commissioned or allowed to be produced. And obviously moving forward, a lot of the skills you've learned today in terms of making inferences and making deductions from the symbols that you've seen in the paintings will help you in future periods of study to actually investigate and analyse other visual sources of other kings and queens across history. Like I say, I've enjoyed speaking to you today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the next week or so. Take care. Bye bye.